We're nearing the start of training camp and the start of the 2018-19 NHL season. And with the off-season winding to an end, I think it's time for me to put out my predictions for this upcoming NHL season, starting off with the Eastern Conference, and specifically the Atlantic Division. In 8th place and coming in last in the division, I have the Ottawa Senators. This was an Ottawa team that really took a major step down last season after making the Eastern Conference Finals and coming within one goal of a Stanley Cup final the year before. They started going full tank. Obviously, there's the whole Erik Karlsson cloud luring above the team. Is he going to stay? Is he going to go? He's probably going to go if Karlsson does go. Any hope this team of coming in anything but last place in the Atlantic, and probably even last place in the Eastern Conference, is gone. There's just been a whole muddle of ownership. They got absolutely fleeced in the Hoffman trade. They traded him to the Sharks so that he'd be out of the division, and the Sharks just immediately flipped him back to Florida. So now he's back in division, and the Sharks got arguably a better return for Hoffman than the Senators did originally. If anything is indicative of how things have been going for the Senators recently, it's that trade. Things are not trending for them in any real direction. If Craig Anderson has a good year, maybe they can push somewhere up out of the basement because they don't have their first round pick this year from the Duchesne trade that's going to Colorado. So I don't see things going very well for the Senators this year. I have them coming last in the division. In 7th, I have the Detroit Red Wings. The Red Wings have a very similar squad to what they had last season, with the exceptions of obviously Filip Zadina coming in and Thomas Vanek on forward, and Jonathan Bernier in net to add another backup option to Jimmy Howard. The Red Wings are still in rebuild mode after the playoff streak ended a couple years ago. They have some good young talent, haven't been bad enough in recent years to get a high draft pick necessary to really spin this team around. They have some very talented young players in like Anthony Mantha, Dylan Larkin, but they just haven't got a young franchise player to build a team around. They haven't got a Barzal or a Besser or a Matthews type. They don't have that key cog to build a team around yet. And I think it's going to take either one of their guys to really just take a huge step forward in development and become that guy, possibly Dylan Larkin, or it's going to take another year or two of poor Red Wings play for them to get a high draft pick and draft that franchise top-tier player that you build a team around. In 6th place, I have the Buffalo Sabres. The Sabres should finally be getting out of the basement this year. Not quite a playoff contender yet. They still are shaky in net, shaky on the back end. However, Rasmus Dahlin from the first overall draft pick, that's a huge help. You get Connor Sheary and Matt Hunwick through a trade with the Penguins. That's more depth on the forward, more depth in D. You get Berglund and Sabaka from the Blues. That's some nice depth that you didn't have before. Building up some nice depth. The continued development of Jack Eichel, Middlestat, Sam Reinhart, etc. should just keep it going. If Eichel can stay healthy and play an entire season, this team could do quite well, especially if Reinhart and Middlestat also just step up and start playing like absolute stars. They could even contend for a playoff spot. You lose Leonard, who was a failed number one goalie experiment. Gain Carter Hutton, who is your new number one goalie experiment. He played quite well with the Blues last season. If he can turn that into a full season as a star starter, kind of like Frederik Andersen's situation in Toronto, then the Sabres could potentially push for a wild card spot. In my opinion, it's going to take another year or two of development, especially on the back end with Dahlin developing to get to that point. But the Sabres team is incredibly close to being a playoff contender. I can see that happening as soon as next season. In 5th place, I have the Montreal Canadiens. Now, I know this may seem a little high to some of you, but my theory is Carey Price does not have 2 off seasons. If Carey Price can regain the form that got him his $10 million a year contract for 8 years, then he alone could possibly carry this team into a wild card spot. A full year from Shea Weber also wouldn't hurt if they could get him for a full year. Of course, injuries last season really hurt the team. Galchenyuk for Max Domi trade was a weird one. If Domi can find some sort of form like he did in the World Juniors a couple years back with when he was playing on a line of Duclair and Reinhardt, just kind of have that type of Max Domi, this could end up being a great trade for this team. I don't see Domi performing that well at an NHL level. At forward, overall, I don't like this team's depth. Of course, goaltending, they're fine if Price remains his form. Defense, if Shea Weber is healthy for the entire season, they're fine. Because of that, I can see this team possibly contending for a wild card spot. Although they're gonna need to have to figure out their center issue for any of that to happen. If they can figure out the center issue and possibly trade for a center earlier in the season, this is a playoff contending team. Otherwise, they're not a basement dweller. They're not really a playoff contender. They're just kind of right in the middle. In fourth, I have the Florida Panthers. The Panthers keep mostly their same team from last year. They just lose Radim Vrbata. Whether or not this team makes the playoffs depends entirely on what Florida Panthers we get. If we get the Florida Panthers that started last season and were kind of low in the standings up until January, February, they're not going to play well. They need the Florida Panthers that closed out last season that out of nowhere made a push for a wild card spot. If they have that Panthers, they could very easily make the playoffs, but they need to just put together an entire full season from that team. Luongo is getting on the older side. He should be good to keep playing like Lou another season or two, and James Reimer is a more than capable backup. Alexander Barkov has quietly become one of the best centers in the league. He does not get enough attention as he's in Florida, but he plays more than any other forward in the NHL. He's a great two-way player. Trocheck is a 30-goal scorer on the second line. He's a dangerous offensive weapon. They add Mike Hoffman to give them more scoring depth. If they can squeeze a 30-goal season out of him, that would be absolutely fantastic and just a complete thorn in the Ottawa Senators' side. If this team's young guys can just continue developing like they are, I could see them very easily pushing on the door for the third playoff spot in the East, possibly pushing for a wild card spot. Currently, I have both wild card spots going to the Metro, which I'll talk about later, but this is a good Panthers team that should not be ignored. In third, I have the Boston Bruins. This is a team that lost a lot of depth players from their playoff run, like Riley Nash, Rick Nash, Nick Holden, Wingles, etc. But they've kept their core intact. They still have the Bergeron, Marchand, Pasternak top line. They still have Chara and McAvoy. Most of their defense is still there. Still have Rask in net. They lose Khudobin, get Halak as a replacement. Zdeno Chara isn't what he used to be, but McAvoy has more than picked up the slack and should be even better this season. So there's no questions about their defensive capabilities and their number one defenseman, because right as Chara started to go, McAvoy stepped right up for this team, and I see them as a playoff team yet again. Are they as large of a cup contender as they were last season? Probably not, but definitely a playoff team. In second, I have my buds, the Toronto Maple Leafs. John Tavares, number one free agent signing. Enough said. Offensively, this is an incredibly dangerous team. Obviously, you Tavares, Matthews, and Nazem Kadri all just right down the middle. Marner, Nylander, all that jazz. Adding in some depth pieces, Josh Uris, Par Lindholm, and Tyler Ennis, all added as depth pieces. The fourth line spot should be a nice little battle between Uris and Lindholm to get it. Possibly Frederic Gauthier coming up from the AHL. Defensively, yes, this team still has question marks. Riley and Gardner are both very good 50-point defensemen. On the right side, this team's kind of weak. We added Ozaganov from the KHL as another Russian right-hand D. Very similar to how we got Zaitsev. And if you can crack the lineup, could be a good addition to this team, especially as a right-handed D, which is always a need. And then Frederik Andersen, who, if he just plays like Frederik Andersen, should be solid in net. This team, very obviously should make the playoffs, should do a lot more than make the playoffs. They're a major cup contender in my book. And in first place, the Tampa Bay Lightning. Pretty much the same team that made the Eastern Conference Final last year. They kept Ryan McDonagh, despite him being a free agent, which just makes them so that much more better on defense with him and Hedman. Another season of Stamkos and Kucherov lighting it up like they did last year will keep this team right at the top of the standings. But if Brayden Point plays like he did last year, is kind of flew under the radar a bit last season with how good Kucherov had been. But Point put up a spectacular season last year. 66 points, 32 goals. He's an incredibly talented second line center. And Vasilevsky in net is one of the best goalies in the NHL. This team has incredible depth despite losing Chris Kunitz. I mean, Killorn and Callahan are both bottom six forwards, which is kind of amazing. I guess at this point of his career, Callahan's probably a third line player on most teams, but Alex Killorn could be a second line player on a lot of teams, and he's on the third on this team. This is an incredibly deep team all around, stacked offensively, stacked defensively. I would not be surprised if the Lightning win a cup this season. They're that good. And now moving on to the Metro. In 8th, I have the New York Islanders. This was an incredibly tough summer for the Islanders. They lost Calvin DeHaan and John Tavares through free agency. They've lost Halak, Kuhlman, just a ton of depth. And they've replaced it with not that much. They fill in their question mark goaltending with Robin Leonard, the Sabres question mark goaltending. On offense, they've added Leo Komarov, Uncle Leo. Treat him well, New York. Matt Martin, Valtteri Filppula. Well, good role players. None of them are going to score a boatload of goals for your team. Filppula's past his prime. Komarov was an all-star when the Leafs were terrible because he had an amazing start to that season. Again, on a terrible Leafs team. He's not going to fill any holes offensively. He'll be decent on the penalty kill. Matt Martin coming back to the Islanders. Tough guy. Fighter. You know what you're getting with him. Matt Barzal will continue to be amazing. This team's fortunate enough that even though they lost Tavares, they still have a franchise player to build around in Matt Barzal. Hopefully they can keep him in New York for this team to rebuild around him. With how good the Metro is this year, though, it's going to be a very tough year for the Islanders, and I don't see them finishing anywhere near the playoffs. 7th, I have the New York Rangers. Last year, the rebuild fully started for the Rangers. They went full fire sale, and now they're left with not necessarily scraps, but close to it. Still have some very good players in Zibanejad, Zuccarello, Chris Kreider. Nowhere near the level of depth that the Rangers had just like 3 or 4 years ago when they were perennial cup contenders, though they never did win one. They still have King Henrik, though he is getting older, and that alone is enough to keep you out of the basement. I mean, if Lundqvist has a spectacular season, like he always does, they could possibly hang around the wildcard spots. I don't see them making it. I don't think they have the depth to make it, and come the trade deadline, they'll probably send off a couple more pieces and end up not in the basement, probably not low enough to get a high draft pick, but not close to the playoff spots. In 6th, I have the Carolina Hurricanes. And this is a hard one for me because, this is a young team who has some great players who's been building up slowly over the season. And you feel that they're so close to being a playoff team, but they're always just missing something. You lose Noah Hanifin, but add Dougie Hamilton and Calvin DeHaan to an already stacked young defense that has the potential to grow to be one of the best in the league. Already probably is one of the better puck-moving defense groups in the league. Then the Canes have some good forwards, but not the elite, not an elite forward group. And then they trade away Jeff Skinner for draft picks, which isn't a very aggressive trade, like this, that doesn't really make sense of the trying to make the playoffs now aspect that you would think the team would be going for. So offensively, they're all on the weaker side. And then their goaltending, they lost Cam Ward, who was their most consistent goalie last year, because the Scott Darling experiment didn't really pan out. And then you had Peter Mrazek, who also has had opportunities to become a starter and hasn't really panned out. So this is a team that, despite having an amazing defense, just really is not there offensively or goaltending-wise, and they're going to suffer for it. In fifth, and taking the second wildcard spot in the East, I have the Philadelphia Flyers. The Flyers added JVR, brought him back over the offseason, adding to an offense that was already really picked up last season, getting 100 points out of Claude Giroux, and of course with Voracek and Couturier playing a strong number one center game, and of course the continued development of Nolan Patrick. And while they did lose some depth pieces, their young guys are more than capable of picking up the slack. Scott Laughton and Travis Konecny come to mind to fill in for Matt Reed and Valtteri Filppula, who are gone. The defense is also young and just continuing to improve if Provorov and Gostisbehere. In net, Elliott and Newsworth are both very decent NHL goalkeepers. Neither of them are the elite goalies needed to really be a cup contender, in my opinion. They're both more than good enough to survive the regular season, so especially together in a duo. I have the Flyers making the playoffs in the last wildcard spot in the East, barring any major fall-aparts, such as a Giroux or Voracek disappearing. But with the addition of JVR, the offense should be kicking even more than it did last season, and they should make the playoffs. Fourth, and taking the first wildcard spot, I have the New Jersey Devils. Taylor Hall just went off last season, won the Hart, really just carried this team into the playoffs. With the continued development of Nico Hischier at center and Pavel Zacha, this team really should just have some good center depth, especially with those young guys added to the veterans of Zajac and Boyle. And they have two really solid goalies in Keith Kincaid and Corey Schneider. If Schneider can get past the injuries they had last season and play like how he did in the playoffs, he could be just unstoppable, and the Devils should easily coast into a playoff spot. But if the defense and the goaltending falters, this team could easily fall out of a playoff spot because the depth isn't amazing, but they are very buoyed by just some amazing high-end talent, especially with how well Taylor Hall played last season. So if Hall falters and has an off year, I don't see them making the playoffs. But if he continues to play strong, if Schneider can just regain his old form, then this team very easily is in the playoffs. In third, I have the Pittsburgh Penguins, who, after the 2-year cup streak came to an end when they lost to the Capitals in the second round last year, had to do their usual off-season salary cap juggling, lost Sheary and Hunwick in the process, but they gained Jack Johnson, who is really a typical Pittsburgh defensive addition, and he's probably an upgrade over Hunwick, so if anything, this defense got better over the offseason. They brought back Matt Cullen, who at his age is not a huge addition, kind of made a bit of fan service, a bit of bringing in like someone who's liked in the dressing room, someone that you know, but it's a depth addition to just strengthen the center corps. I mean, they have Crosby and Malkin, obviously, and to keep Derek Brassard around for once they don't need to do another third-line center addition at some point over the season, because they have one going right into it. So this team obviously is going to make the playoffs, obviously is going to be a cup contender. It's the Penguins. What else can you say? In second place, I have the Columbus Blue Jackets. They are just all around a very solid team. Offense, like on the offensive side of things, they add Riley Nash for some depth. Defensively, they lose Jack Johnson, but they have some very solid young defenders in Seth Jones, Werenski, Ryan Murray. And they probably have the best, most consistent goalie in the NHL right now in Sergei Bobrovsky. So this is a very good team that could possibly, hopefully put things together and finally win a playoff series this year. They really should be able to give them the lap they have. The one thing they have to do, though, is they have to keep Artemi Panarin. Panarin is just such a key piece of their offense, just is basically the face of their offense. He is the most important guy for them to keep this season, and there are talks that he wants to leave. So if this team wants to be a contender, they have to keep Panarin. And if he leaves, I don't think they have the offensive depth or the offensive ability to make a playoff run. I don't see them missing the playoffs even if Panarin leaves, given just their depth, but I feel they really do need Panarin to make a deep run. And in first place, I have the Washington Capitals. It is very rare in this NHL for a team to win the Stanley Cup and then keep most of their roster for the following season. And with the exception of losing Grubauer, Beagle, and Chiasson, that's what the Capitals have done. They traded away Orpik, and then after he was bought out, signed him back. So they've kept pretty much everyone, dumped most of the Orpik contract, and then added Nick Dowd as a replacement for Jay Beagle. But again, this was the Stanley Cup champion team, so they should be very good. There might be a little bit of a cup hangover at the beginning of the season, and because of that, they could possibly be passed for top spot in the Metro, but barring that, I don't see anyone in the Metro better than them this year. I don't think anyone in their division has improved enough to surpass the champs. So that's it for my Eastern Conference preview. I'll do the Western Conference soon. I'm not going to do playoff predictions as to who makes the Cup final yet, because honestly it could go anyway right now. And Carlson's still in the trading block. Depending on where he goes to, it could completely shake everything up. I'm going to refrain from making playoff predictions. I'm just going to stick with the regular season ones right now. Well, at least in the East, especially in the East, this is looking to be a fantastic season. Stay tuned for the Western Conference predictions.